Betty Thompson's stiff. Time-worn hands froze mid-snip above the rose bush when she spotted them two little black girls edging slowly toward her house. The 80-year-old widow straightened, her heart pounding harder than it had in years. Twins, short curly hair, bounced with each timid step, their wide eyes brimming with a fear no child should ever carry. By the time they reached her porch, Betty's breath had turned shallow. The girls lifted their faces, worry etched across their small features. And when they finally spoke, voices fragile as whispers, their words shattered the stillness of Betty's quiet world, dragging her into a nightmare she never imagined. Waiting for her, the hum of bees mingled with the soft rustle of leaves as Betty had gone about her day in the garden, losing herself in the comfort of her flowers. At 80, this was where she found her peace. Each petal, each leaf held echoes of her past, the laughter of her late husband George, the tender memories of decades stitched together beneath the canopy of blooming roses. Her arthritic fingers, though stubborn, moved with practiced grace as she trimmed back a thorny stem. Her thoughts wandering to days when the neighborhood had been alive with voices and laughter. She remembered how children's shouts once rang down the street, how neighbors lingered over fences with gossip and smiles, how the smoky aroma of barbecues floated through long summer evenings. But now, the street had grown hollow, emptied of its spirit. Houses stood abandoned or replaced by strangers who kept to themselves, leaving Betty as one of the last fragile threads tying the present to a more vibrant past. She paused, wiped her brow with her glove, and let her gaze drift to the house next door, silent, empty, its for sale sign like a scar marking the decline of her once thriving community. Her sigh was heavy with loneliness. Then a sound stirred the stillness. The low rumble of an engine drew nearer, swelling until Betty's pulse quickened. A moving truck screeched to a halt in front of the vacant house. Her heart leapt new neighbors. At last. For the first time in years, something stirred in her chest. Hope. She kept her eyes trained, trying to look casual as her imagination raced ahead. Who would they be? A young family bringing back the joyful chaos of children's laughter? Retired couple eager for companionship over tea and stories? Maybe someone to stitch a little warmth back into the cold silence of the block. Then the passenger door opened. A woman in her early 30s stepped out. Her skin was a deep, radiant ebony, made brighter by a flowing yellow sundress. Her expression was a careful blend of nerves and determination as she surveyed her new world. Behind her, two girls hopped. From the truck twins, unmistakably, their matching braids bouncing with curiosity as they took in their surroundings. 6 years old, maybe? Their presence stirred something long dormant in Betty's heart. It had been so long since children's laughter touched this street. Already she found herself smiling at the thought. But then, movement at the driver's side drew Betty's attention. A man climbed. Out a white man, broad-shouldered, early 40s, with arms that flexed as he stretched. His eyes swept the street with sharp calculation, not warmth. Betty's smile faltered. Something about the picture didn't fit. Father, the sharp contrast in their appearances left her unsure. Perhaps just a boyfriend, maybe a fresh start after a divorce. That would make sense. Yet the uneasy prickle at the back of her neck refused to quiet, as though sensing her gaze. The woman's eyes lifted and met Betty's. A smile spread across her face, warm, disarming. Betty responded with a wave, and for a brief moment, the unease melted. Perhaps she'd been too quick to judge. Perhaps this family was exactly the kind of life her neighborhood needed. Still, Betty noted the truck had carried in surprisingly little, only a few battered suitcases. No heavy furniture, no boxes of a life transported. They weren't settling. They were starting from nothing. Odd, strange enough to catch in the back of Betty's mind like a splinter. She longed to step across the lawn, to introduce herself, to grasp at this chance for connection. But she stopped herself. They'd need time, she reasoned. Time to adjust. She could wait. There would be opportunities later. And yet as the sun sank low, washing the street in its amber glow, Betty lingered in her garden, her thoughts tangled. With curiosity, her chest tight with a flicker of unease. New neighbors had come at last. But whether they'd bring life back to the street or something darker was a question she would soon wish she'd never asked. Betty gathered her gardening tools and shuffled toward the house, pausing at the gate for one last glance at the newcomer's home. The curtains were drawn tight, shadows sealed inside, and no sound slipped through the walls. A chill pricked at her skin. Something about that silence felt unnatural, too heavy, too deliberate. She forced a small laugh at herself. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered. "They're just tired from the move." With that, she closed her own door. Trying to look forward to the possibilities the coming days might bring, night settled over the neighborhood like a blanket. And Betty tucked herself into the comfort of her evening ritual. The soft glow of the television mingled with the warm flicker of the fireplace, shadows dancing across the walls as though alive. In her hands, she cradled a delicate china teacup, steam curling from the chamomile blend she drank every night. It was a ritual that once belonged to her and George, her late husband, and though it now brought comfort, it also left her aching with his absence.
Ow.
Her gaze drifted toward the armchair across from her. For a fleeting second, she could almost see him there, smiling, nodding, waiting to share the small stories of the day. The house creaked softly, settling into the night. Betty tugged her cardigan tighter, focusing on the television. A rainforest documentary painted her living room. With lush greens and soothing narration, the quiet pressed in, but the familiar routine eased her loneliness. She sipped her tea, eyelids growing heavy, then dash bang, the sharp, violent noise ripped through the calm, echoing in the night like a slammed door or something heavy striking the floor. Betty froze, her heart thudding hard in her chest. Psst, the sound had come from next door. Before she could fully register it, faint cries followed, high-pitched, muffled, and unmistakably distressed. Betty's breath caught. She leaned forward, straining her ears, every nerve alive with dread. And then, silence. Only the fire crackled, and the television murmured on, as if nothing had happened at all. Betty sat rigid, her cooling tea forgotten, listening, waiting for another sound. But minutes crept by, the night stretching unnaturally still. "They're just settling in," she told herself sternly, forcing her racing pulse to slow. Moving is stressful, especially with children. Maybe one of the girls had a tantrum, maybe something fell, yet no amount of reasoning could erase the sharpness of that bang, or the haunting echo of those screams. Too real. Too terrified, she shivered. Part of her longed to march across the lawn, to knock on their door and make sure everyone was safe. But it was late. She barely knew them. She couldn't risk seeming like the nosy old widow next door. "I'm overreacting," she whispered, convincing herself as best she could. Betty swallowed the last of her tea cold now, then moved through the motions of her bedtime routine. She banked the fire, turned off the television, and climbed the stairs. Slowly, though unease coiled in her stomach. Even when she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound replayed in her head. That bang. Those cries. Sleep tugged at her, but unease gnawed until she finally made a decision. Tomorrow, she would bake a cake. She'd welcome her new neighbors the proper, wakenly. Maybe then she could put her worries to rest. Morning dawned, bright and deceptively cheerful, washing away much of the dread from the night before. Betty rose early, determined to focus on her plan. In the kitchen, she set to work on her famous lemon drizzle cake, a recipe passed down from her mother. One that never failed to soften even the hardest faces. The familiar motion soothed her, zesting the lemons, folding in the sugar, watching the batter swirl into golden promise. Soon, the house filled with the fragrance of citrus and vanilla, chasing away shadows. She dressed with care in a floral blouse and her favorite cardigan. She wanted to look warm, welcoming. As she frosted the cooled cake, she rehearsed what she might say. Perhaps she could invite them for coffee, show the girls her garden, offer tips about the town. Anything to break the barrier of silence between the houses. Boxing the cake, Betty stepped outside with a hopeful smile. But as she reached their porch, her steps faltered. The curtains were still tightly drawn. The house seemed far too quiet for one that held children. The hush pressed against her ears. She rang the doorbell. After a pause, the door opened and there stood the woman from yesterday. Up close, Betty could see her properly now. Melanie, she introduced herself. Her smile was warm, but behind her dark eyes was a shadow weariness, perhaps, or something else harder to name. "Good morning, Betty," said brightly, thrusting the cake forward as if it could banish her unease. "I'm Betty, from next door. I thought I'd welcome you with a little homemade treat." Lenny's smile deepened, almost grateful. "That's so kind of you. I'm Melanie. It's lovely to meet you properly. Asterisk." But before Betty could answer, movement stirred behind her. The man appeared, the one she had seen yesterday. He filled the doorway with his presence, his shoulders blocking the light from inside. His eyes narrowed at Betty, cold and assessing. "Who is it, Mel?" he demanded, his voice clipped, his tone edged with suspicion. Melanie's smile faltered just slightly. "This is Betty," she explained quickly. "Our neighbor. She brought us a welcome cake." The warmth between the two women thinned instantly, placed by a tension that seemed to darken the doorway itself. The man Tom, Betty would later learn, stepped forward, his broad frame eclipsing Melanie from view. "I'm Tom, Melanie's boyfriend," he said curtly, his voice clipped, unwelcoming. "Thanks for the cake, but we're busy. Lots of unpacking to do." The cold dismissal made Betty's heart dip. She forced a smile, keeping her voice light. "Oh, of course." Thought, "Perhaps once you're settled, you might join me for coffee. It would be lovely to get to know you better." But Tom's posture stiffened. He kept the door angled, his body positioned like a barrier, as if deliberately hiding the house's interior. "That won't be necessary," he said flatly. "We're private people. We'll let you know if we need anything." Behind him, Betty caught a fleeting glimpse of Melanie's expression. The warmth had drained from her features, replaced by a look of weary resignation. Almost imperceptibly, Melanie mouthed, "Thank you." Then Tom snatched the cake from Betty's hands, and with a perfunctory "thanks again, have a good day," began to shut the door. The door clicked shut with a finality that left Betty staring at the wood, bewildered and bruised by the exchange. Reserved neighbors she could understand, but this, Tom's abruptness, his refusal to allow even a sliver of friendliness, the way he shielded Melanie from view. It lodged in her mind like a splinter. As Betty shuffled back to her house, a gnawing unease took root. The excitement she'd felt about new neighbors soured into a heavy, unsettled worry. All morning she busied herself dusting shelves, rearranging knickknacks, tending her plants, but her thoughts spun relentlessly back to the strange interaction, to Melanie's muted gratitude, to the muffled cries she had heard the night before. "Maybe I'm just being a meddling old woman," she tried to assure herself. Yet her instincts rarely betrayed her, and they whispered now with steady persistence, "Something is wrong behind those curtains." By afternoon, Betty found herself absently watering her indoor plants. The task usually soothed her, but today her mind refused to still. She was bent over a fern when something outside caught her eye. She froze across the lawn. The twins were moving toward her house. The little girls she had glimpsed yesterday. Their steps were furtive, their small bodies hunched as if trying to make themselves invisible. Every few paces they cast anxious glances over their shoulders toward their own home. Oh, fear shadowed there. Young faces, too stark to mistake. Betty's stomach tightened. This wasn't the carefree exploration of children in a new neighborhood. This was desperation. She set down her watering can and hurried to the front door, opening it just as the girls climbed her porch steps, their wide eyes fixed on her, brimming with a fragile mixture of hope and dread. "Hello, dears," Betty said softly, crouching despite the sharp protest of her knees. "Is everything all right?" The girls exchanged a glance, one twin biting her lip before leaning close, her whisper trembling. "Our new daddy doesn't like us." The words struck Betty like ice, her chest constricted, her color drained. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked gently, struggling to keep her voice calm. But before the child could answer, a booming voice shattered the moment. "Girls, what do you think you're doing? Get back here now." Betty's head snapped up. Tom was striding across the lawn, his face twisted with anger, his voice a whip that cracked the air. The twins flinched, their small shoulders jerking at the sound. "I'm sorry," one of the girls whispered hurriedly. "We have to go." With one last pleading look at Betty, the twins bolted toward their house. Tom met them halfway, seizing each by the arm. He yanked them toward the door, his grip rough, its expression thunderous. Betty stood frozen on the porch, her heart pounding against her ribs. The girl's whispered confession echoed in her mind. "Our new daddy doesn't like us." The door slammed. With such violence it reverberated across the yard, the sound hanging in the air long after Tom dragged the children inside. For a long moment, Betty could only stand rooted to the spot, the peaceful afternoon fractured into something darker. At last she lowered herself shakily into her favorite armchair, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. The little girl's words replayed over and over. "Our new daddy doesn't like us." With every repetition, dread coiled tighter. She couldn't banish the image of their terrified faces or the way Tom had manhandled them. Am I imagining things? Overreacting? She asked herself desperately. Perhaps he's just strict. Perhaps the children are exaggerating, but deep down, she knew the truth. Her instincts refused to let her ignore. The fear in those young eyes had been real, too raw, too urgent, and it whispered of something far more, sinister than mere strinus. As the minutes dragged on, Betty wrestled with a gnawing conflict. Should she intervene? It wasn't her place to meddle in another family's affairs. Was it? Yet the question clawed at her. What if something truly was wrong? Could she live with the guilt of staying silent? Images flooded her mind, the fleeting warmth of Melanie's hushed voice when they'd spoken, the muffled cries she had heard the previous night, and Tom's suffocatingly controlling demeanor. Each on its own might be dismissed, but strung together, they formed a picture Betty could no longer ignore, a picture that felt dangerous. What would George do? She whispered to the stillness, invoking her late husband as though his wisdom lingered in the air. And in her heart, she almost heard him, his steady voice, urging her to trust her instincts. To err on the side of protecting children, with trembling hands, she reached for the phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, paralyzed by a familiar wave of doubt. What if she was mistaken? What if she unleashed chaos on an innocent family? But then she remembered the twins, those haunted eyes, the way they hunched as if trying to vanish, their silent plea for anyone to notice. No child should ever shrink like that inside their own home. Drawing a shaky breath, Betty dialed 911. As the line connected, she pressed her free hand to her chest, silently praying. She wasn't making a terrible mistake. 911? What's your emergency? The operator's calm, practiced tone filled her ear. Betty's voice wavered. I don't know if this counts as an emergency, but I'm very worried about my new neighbors, especially the children. Can you tell me what's concerning? You, ma'am. The operator asked, patient and steady. Piece by piece, Betty laid it all out. The disturbing noises, Tom's aggression, and most of all her chilling interaction with the twins. The little girl told me their new daddy doesn't like them, she explained, her throat tightening. And when he called them back, the look in their eyes. I've never seen children so terrified. The operator listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification. When Betty finally fell silent, the pause that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then came the grave response. Thank you for calling this in, ma'am. Reports of possible child endangerment are taken very seriously. I'm dispatching officers immediately. I'll need your address and your neighbors as well. Relief and fear swirled in equal measure as Betty gave the information. She had set something in motion now, something that could not be undone. Officers are on their way. Please, do not try to intervene. Stay inside and wait for them to arrive, the operator instructed firmly. After hanging up, Betty sank into her chair, her pulse pounding. Had she done the right thing? Only time would reveal the answer. But when she pictured the frightened little girls again, she knew she couldn't have lived with herself if she'd stayed silent. Now, all she could do was wait. The minutes crawled by. Betty paced the living room, moving from the window to the wall and back again, straining to catch any sound from next door. The neighborhood seemed unnaturally still, the silence feeding her dread. She nearly picked up the phone again, when at last the faint rise and fall of sirens drifted closer. They grew louder, then cut off abruptly as two cruisers rounded the corner, lights flashing silently. Betty exhaled, weak with relief. 4 officers stepped out to men, 2 women, their faces set with a professional resolve that steadied her nerves. After a brief exchange near their cars, 2 split off toward the neighbor's house while the other 2 strode to Betty's front door. The knock came sharp, deliberate. It startled her despite her anticipation. She hurried to open the door, finding herself face to face with a middle-aged man whose voice carried a firm kindness. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Officer Johnson. This is Officer Rivera. We're here about your neighbors. Did you make the call?" Betty's throat tightened, but she nodded. "Yes, I'm Betty Thompson. Please, come in." They settled in her living room. Officer Johnson readied his notepad while Rivera's sharp eyes quietly scanned the space, as though every detail mattered. Double quotes Mrs. Thompson, Johnson said, pen poised. "Can you walk us through exactly what led you to reach out today?" Betty swallowed, gathered her courage, and began to recount every unsettling detail of the past day and a half, the noises, the fear, the children. When Betty described the uneasy first meeting with Melanie, her attempt to welcome them with a cake, and finally the chilling encounter with the twins, the 2 officers began exchanging tense glances. They interrupted gently with clarifying questions, their expressions hardening as her story unfolded. "And you're absolutely certain," the little girl said, "our new daddy doesn't like us?" Officer Rivera asked at last, her dark eyes locking onto Betty's with unnerving intensity. "Yes," Betty replied, her voice firm. Those were her exact words. "You should have seen the look on their faces, Uter, terror right before Tom called them back. I've never seen children so afraid." Officer Johnson jotted down a final note before snapping his notepad shut. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. You did the right thing calling us. Reports like this, we treat them with the utmost seriousness, especially when children are involved." "What happens now?" Betty asked, twisting her hands in her lap, her nerves fraying with each passing second. "We'll go next door and conduct a welfare check," Rivera explained. "We'll speak to the adults and, if possible, the children privately." "Our colleagues are already over there," Johnson added. "May need to ask you for a formal statement later. Would you be willing?" "Of course," Betty said quickly. "Anything to protect those little girls." The officers rose and Betty escorted them to the door. As they stepped out, Rivera turned back.
"Us."
Mrs. Thompson, most people would have ignored their instincts or told themselves it wasn't their concern. "What you did today may make all the difference." The words lodged in Betty's throat like a lump. "I just hope it's not too late," she whispered. "We'll do everything we can," Johnson assured her. "For now, stay inside. We'll update you as soon as possible." Betty closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her chest tight, heart hammering. She whispered a quick prayer for Melanie, for the twins, for justice before hurrying. To her window, through the glass, she watched the officers approach the neighbor's home. They knocked once, waited, then again louder. The silence felt eerie, unreal, like a scene from a crime drama bleeding into the quiet of her suburban street. At last, the door creaked open. Melanie appeared, shoulders hunched, body language guarded. Even from across the yard, Betty noticed her eyes darting nervously, flickering between the officers and something or someone hidden in the shadows behind her. The officers spoke calmly, but firmly. Betty couldn't hear the words, only saw. Melanie nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging in surrender. Then, a dark shape filled the doorway. Tom, even at a distance, his presence radiated menace. His scowl carved deep lines across his face, his bulk looming protectively, or was it possessively, behind Melanie? Betty's pulse spiked. She saw Tom's lips move, his gestures sharp, angry. Though the exact words didn't carry, his raised voice did low, hostile, simmering with fury. The officers stayed calm, one speaking softly, the other watching Tom like a predator about to strike. After tense minutes, Rivera gently drew Melanie aside. Tom bristled, stepping forward to block her, but Johnson moved between them, his stance immovable. The tension at the doorway coiled tighter. No right, private property, mind your own business. Tom's voice carried now, jagged and furious. Betty pressed her hands to the cool glass, her heart thudding wildly. Where were the twins? Were they inside, watching this unravel in terror? The thought hollowed her stomach. Suddenly Tom roared, his voice breaking into a shout. You can't do this. You have no right to talk to her alone. Before Betty could process, Tom lunged forward, arms shooting out toward Melanie. Gasps tore from Betty's throat as the calm shattered. Johnson moved like lightning, blocking and restraining Tom in a swift, practiced motion. While Rivera whisked Melanie further from the door, shouts erupted, chaos boiling over. From the corner of her eye, Betty saw two more officers sprint from their cruisers to assist. Then movement upstairs. Betty's breath caught. Two small, pale faces peeked from behind a curtain. The twins. Their frightened eyes barely visible before they vanished from sight. Betty clapped a trembling hand over her mouth, tears stinging. Was this her fault? She had set everything in motion with that call. But deep inside, another voice cut through her guilt. No, this needed to happen. Whatever dark secret lurked in that house could no longer remain hidden, as Tom was forced. Down his face twisted in rage, and Melanie was led away. Trembling, Betty whispered one last desperate prayer. For Melanie's strength, for the girl's safety, and for justice to finally break through the shadows. The quiet afternoon had erupted into chaos, and Betty knew with a sinking certainty that nothing would ever return to the way it was. She could do now was pray that out of this storm, a safer future might finally rise for Melanie and her daughters, partially hidden behind the thick shadow of a rhododendron bush. Betty's gaze fixed on Melanie, who stood with Officer Rivera. Even from a distance, Betty could sense the tension radiating off the young woman. Melanie's arms were clutched tightly around her body, as if sheer willpower was the only thing keeping her from shattering. Officer Rivera remained close, her stance protective but careful not to suffocate, giving Melanie just enough space to breathe. Though Betty could not hear their words, the scene itself spoke volumes. The officer's voice moved in a low, steady rhythm, her expression soft, coaxing. Melanie shook her head again and again, eyes locked on the ground, refusing, perhaps unable to meet anyone's gaze. Rivera did not relent, her tone patient, almost hypnotic, until Betty noticed the first crack in Melanie's armor, a subtle trembling in her shoulders. Then, like a dam rupturing, the years of silence gave way. Melanie collapsed into herself, burying her face in her hands, her frame racked with violent sobs. Rivera's hand came to rest on her arm, steady and grounding, her lips shaping words. Betty couldn't hear but could icily imagine our assurances, promises of safety. The sobbing went on for long, raw minutes, until it seemed Melanie had emptied years of hidden grief and terror into the open air. Betty's heart twisted painfully, wishing she could reach out and hold her too. At last, sobs gave way to broken words, hiccuped phrases, strangled confessions. Though Betty couldn't catch them, she could see the torment etched in every line of Melanie's face. Rivera leaned in, listening with rapt attention, her expression darkening with each revelation. Soon her notepad was out, her pen flying. Each word Melanie spoke recorded like pieces of a puzzle, finally being fit together with each admission. Melanie's body seemed to uncoil, her once hunched frame straightening, as if every word lifted some invisible weight off her shoulders. By the time Rivera tucked the notepad away, something had shifted. The officer placed both hands firmly on Melanie's shoulders, meeting her eyes with a quiet intensity. Melanie nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. Then an eruption. From the front of the house, Tom's voice thundered again, laced with fury. Betty's stomach lurched. Shouts rose in volume, desperate, ugly. Melanie flinched as though struck, instinctively retreating a step. Rivera instantly moved into position, sliding between Melanie and the sound of danger. One hand steadied Melanie, the other radioed in sharp-clipped words. Moments later, flashing lights tore through the afternoon gloom. Two more police cruisers screeched onto the street, sirens slicing the tension. Officers poured out, swarming the scene like a tide. Betty exhaled for the first time in minutes. The arrival of reinforcements bringing a fragile sense of order. Tom, however, only grew more frenzied. His voice had devolved into a stream of venomous obscenities, his face twisted grotesquely in rage. He thrashed against the officer's grip, his eyes darting wildly for escape routes, finding none. When one officer approached with handcuffs glinting in the sunlight, Betty saw Tom's eyes widen, erupted, his struggles multiplying. "You can't do this," bellowed, voice cracking with desperation. "I haven't done anything wrong. This is all a misunderstanding." His words fell flat against the iron wall of law. The officers moved with calm precision, snapping the cuffs over his wrists with a definitive click that echoed through the stunned silence of the street. As Tom was restrained, Betty noticed movement by the house. Melanie, guided by Rivera's steady hand, stepped forward into view. Her face was streaked with tears, but her chin was lifted with a new, unfamiliar resolve. Tom's eyes locked onto her instantly, and his demeanor changed in a flash. "Melanie, tell them," he pleaded, his voice breaking into something almost pathetic. "Tell them this is all a mistake. You know I love you, you know we're happy. But the girls, tell them." Melanie faltered for a heartbeat, then straightened under Rivera's gentle touch. She drew in a sharp breath, lifted her chin, said the words that cut through the air like a blade. "No more lies, Tom, it's over." The mask slipped. Tom's features contorted, his face warping with fury. "You ungrateful snake," he spat, lunging at her despite the cuffs digging into his wrists. Officers clamped down, restraining him as he fought like a cornered animal. "That's enough," one officer barked. "You're under arrest for domestic abuse and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," asterisk as the rights were read. Betty watched Melanie sag slightly, the exhaustion and release written in every line of her body. Rivera caught her, steadying her, whispering quiet words that gave her the strength to remain standing. Around them, neighbors clustered, their hushed murmurs carrying shock, disbelief, sympathy. Betty saw it clearly the way they stared at Melanie, realizing what had been hiding in plain sight all this time. She wondered bitterly how many of them had suspected something but stayed silent, just as she had. Tom was shoved into the back of a cruiser, still spewing threats and denials, but Betty's attention shifted to the front door. Two small figures appeared, Melanie's daughters, their frightened faces pale against the afternoon light. An officer guided them gently out, his hand protective on their shoulders. And for the first time that day, Betty allowed herself to believe maybe, just maybe, a new beginning was possible. Their eyes widened as they took in the chaos around. Them fingers interlaced so tightly their knuckles turned white. The moment Melanie spotted her daughters, instinct overpowered caution. She tore away from Officer Rivera's grasp, stumbling forward until she collapsed to her knees, arms flung. Wide as she gathered them in a desperate embrace, the three clung to each other with raw, shuddering sobs, tears born of both deliverance and the dread of what came next. From her window, Betty felt her throat tighten. The reunion was both heartbreaking and breathtaking, pain etched so deeply into the family that even joy seemed fragile. Yet beneath the anguish, she saw love, unshakable, resilient. In that instant, Betty knew with absolute certainty she had done the right thing by making that call. Behind them, Tom was shoved into the back of a cruiser, his furious roars muffled by the slam of the door. Betty's gaze shifted back to the family as another officer crouched beside them, his tone gentle but insistent. They needed to come to the station, to speak, to be protected, to begin untangling the nightmare. Melanie gathered her daughters close, nodding faintly. As they were escorted to the waiting vehicle, her eyes swept across the gawking neighbors until finally they locked with Betty's. For a heartbeat, everything fell silent. Then Melanie's lips curved into a trembling smile. Gratitude, recognition, a silent bond. Betty raised her hand in a small, trembling wave, pouring every ounce of compassion into that simple gesture. Moments later, the cruisers turned the corner, sirens wailing into the distance, leaving behind an eerie hush. One by one, the neighbors slipped away, their murmured speculations fading until the street lay still again. But Betty remained at her window, her pulse still thundering as though she had been part of the battle rather than just a witness. Was about to step back when something made her freeze. The cruiser carrying Melanie and the twins had returned, pulling quietly to the curb. Confused, she leaned closer as the door opened and Melanie stepped out, her hands clutching her daughter's. They lingered on the sidewalk, a small broken unit staring at the house that had been both shelter and cage. Melanie inhaled deeply, bracing herself, and then without warning, the girls tore free of her grasp. Betty's breath caught. Instead of running toward their home, they bolted across the lawn, straight toward her. Her heart lurched. She stumbled for the door, flinging it open, just as the twins scrambled onto her porch, their tear-streaked faces lifted to hers, eyes wide with terror and fragile hope. "Oh, my darlings," Betty whispered, dropping to her knees despite the sharp protest of her joints. Her arms opened instinctively and the girls threw themselves into her embrace. Their small bodies quaked against her chest, their sobs wrenching. Betty clutched them tighter, tears flooding her eyes. She could feel their fear, their relief, their confusion vibrating through their tiny frames. "You're safe now," she murmured, her voice breaking. "You're safe." One of the twins tilted her face upward, her voice trembling but sure. "Thank you for helping us." The words were faint, yet heavy with the weight of survival. Betty's heart broke and healed in the same instant. Pulled them closer. "You're so very brave," she whispered, stroking their hair. "Both of you." Movement stirred in the corner of her eye. Melanie was crossing the lawn, each step hesitant yet determined, her face a storm of emotions. Relief, guilt, terror, gratitude. Reaching the porch, she faltered, eyes glistening. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice raw. "I don't even know what to say, how to thank you." Betty shook her head firmly, still cradling the twins. "There's no need for thanks," she said softly. "I only did what anyone should." The words cracked something open in Melanie. Her knees buckled, and she sank down beside Betty, tears streaming freely. "I was so afraid," she confessed, barely audible. "I didn't know how to escape, how to protect them. I thought no one would ever believe me." Betty reached for her trembling hand, squeezing it tight. Her eyes shone with quiet conviction. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice steady. "You're the courageous one. It takes unimaginable strength to break free." For a long moment, the four of them stayed there on the porch, battered, trembling, but finally together as though the world itself was holding its breath. They lingered on Betty's porch, an unlikely gathering forged not by choice but by tragedy and compassion. The twins sat pressed between Betty and their mother, their sobs slowly fading into shuddering hiccups. Melanie clutched Betty's hand tightly, as though siphoning strength from the older woman's calm, unwavering presence. Betty, her weathered face shadowed by porch light, made a silent vow. No matter how heavy the days ahead became, she would stand beside this fragile family. She might be old, she thought, but her heart still beat with love, and with the will to make a difference almost. As if she had plucked the thought from Betty's mind, Melanie gave her hand a faint squeeze. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice steadier now. "For everything." Betty's lips curved into a quiet smile, though her chest ached with the weight of what lay ahead. "We'll get through this together," she promised. In the wake of Tom's arrest, Betty's role evolved from watchful neighbor into unshakable guardian. Her once silent home became a refuge for Melanie and the twins, a sanctuary where shadows of fear began to loosen their grip. The kitchen table, once the stage for Betty's solitary meals, now brimmed with the clatter of dishes and the warmth of shared meals. Melanie stopped by often, drawn to the steady counsel and sympathetic ears she found there. And Sophia gravitated toward Betty too, chasing comfort in her presence and safety in her gentle smile. When the chaos of legal proceedings swallowed Milana court dates, tense meetings with lawyers, endless counseling sessions, Betty stepped in without hesitation. She became the twins' anchor, watching them with tender vigilance, and slowly, Under her care, their fear unraveled. Shh. Eyes brightened. Hesitant giggles gave way to shrieks of laughter, and Betty's quiet rooms echoed with the sound of little feet. Once more, her support stretched further than simple kindness. Betty stood shoulder to shoulder with Melanie against the storm of bureaucracy papers. Forms, social services, aid applications all spread across her dining table until it resembled more war room than household. Together, they waded through the maze, piece by piece. And as they did, something changed. Melanie straightened her shoulders. Her words grew surer, and an ember of resolve flickered to life in her eyes. The twins, once ghost-like with fear, now carried the air of children rediscovering joy. Laughter spilling recklessly through Betty's home. One evening, as the family gathered over supper, Sophia froze mid-bite, her fork suspended in the air. Her gaze fixed on Betty with an innocence both piercing and profound. "Are you our guardian angel?" she asked softly. The question struck Betty like a tremor through her chest. Her throat tightened, but she managed to answer, her voice barely above a whisper, "Oh, my dear, I'm only a neighbor who cares." Melanie's hand slid across the table, gripping hers with a ferocity born of gratitude. "No," she said, eyes glistening. "You are so much more than that. Without you, I don't know how we would have survived." Betty looked at the three faces before her, illuminated by the warm glow of the kitchen light. And in that moment, realization struck her with the force of revelation. In healing them, she had unknowingly healed herself. The ache of loneliness that had haunted her since George's passing had been replaced by laughter, by belonging, by purpose. Her once quiet existence had been rewritten into something richer, fuller, and infinitely more alive.